He refused 10 brides. Until he saw the forgotten girl standing in the rain. The storm came without warning. So did she. Hayden Quinn, Duke of Vane, had survived war. He had buried his father in frozen ground, cleared debts that were not his, and returned to a castle that felt more like an obligation than a home. He was not a man who broke easily. So when his aunt, Lady Alia Quinn, announced she had arranged 10 brides, 10 polished, perfectly suitable young women, Hayden did not protest. He simply took his place by the window and watched the carriages arrive one by one, the way a man watches whether he cannot stop and does not intend to stand in. He already knew he would choose none of them. Then the sky split open. The storm hit Vane Court like something with a grudge, savage, sudden, without apology. Silk hems flew. Guests scattered. A mare broke loose in the courtyard, wild-eyed and screaming, hoofs cracking against wet cobblestone while footmen stumbled and froze. Every one of the 10 brides ran. Every one, except a girl he did not recognize. She was not dressed for a duke's house. A worn grey cloak, soaked flat against her frame. No pearls. No careful hair. She stood in the full fury of the rain as though it were nothing, raised one steady hand toward the panicked horse, and spoke. Hayden could not hear her words through the glass. He did not need to. He watched the mare's frantic circling slow, watched its head drop, watched it move toward her open palm like it had simply decided to trust her. The courtyard went still. Hayden realized he had forgotten to breathe. She did not look triumphant. She did not look around to see who had noticed. She simply stood there in the rain, one hand resting gently on the horse's nose, already thinking about something else entirely, a woman completely unbothered by her own quiet courage. He turned from the window and found his secretary, Max Andrews, in the corridor. "The girl in the grey cloak," Hayden said. "Find out who she is." Max blinked. "She is not one of the brides, Your Grace. She came only as a companion to Lady Keris Humphrey. Her name is Catherine Phillips. She is nobody." Hayden looked back toward the courtyard one last time. "Find out who she is," he repeated quietly. Because nobody, in his experience, stood in a storm like that. Welcome to Forbidden Diaries. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Vane Court had not changed. That was the trouble with old houses. They held their shape while everything inside them shifted beyond recognition. Hayden Quinn rode through the iron gates in the grey quiet of early afternoon, his coat still carrying the particular cold of the northern roads. The footman straightened. The housekeeper appeared at the top of the stone steps with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment. He dismounted without ceremony, handed off the reins, and walked inside without pausing to admire the view he had grown up with and long stopped seeing. The war had given him many things he had not asked for. A bad shoulder. A preference for silence. A specific impatience with rooms that smelled of candle wax and old ambition. Vane Court, with its oil portraits and its echoing corridors and its absolute certainty of its own importance, smelled of little else. Lady Alia Quinn was waiting in the drawing room. She did not embrace him. That was not her way. She looked him over with the efficient eye of a woman cataloguing damage, decided he was functional enough, and gestured toward the chair across from hers. "You look thin," she said. "I'm well," he said. "Thank you for asking." She ignored this and poured the tea herself, which meant she had already dismissed the staff for this particular conversation. That alone told him everything. 14, she said, setting his cup before him. He looked at her. "I have invited 14 young women of suitable family and disposition," she continued, with the calm of someone announcing a dinner menu. "They will arrive within the fortnight. You will be present, you will be civil, and you will, God willing, choose one. Alia. The estate needs an heir, Hayden. You need a reason to come home that isn't a funeral." She said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. "I'm not asking you to perform happiness. I'm asking you to try." He looked at the tea he had not touched. Outside the window, the grounds of Vane Court stretched flat and grey toward the tree line, and the sky above them was already beginning to do something ominous. He said nothing, which, with Lady Arlia Quinn, had never once counted as a refusal. The brides arrived over 3 days, in carriages that grew progressively grander, accompanied by mothers who smiled with the focused intensity of women playing the longest game of their lives. Hayden received them all with the same measured courtesy, a handshake, a correct smile, a question about the journey, and excused himself at the earliest opportunity each time. By the 3rd evening, he had taken to the library. It was the one room in Vane Court that had never demanded anything of him. The books did not require conversation. The fire asked nothing. He had been standing at the window with a glass he had stopped drinking from when the first crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead, and the rain that followed was not rain so much as a verdict. He watched the courtyard below dissolve into chaos. The carriages that had not yet been moved to the coach-house lurched as the horses panicked. Footmen ran. 2 of the brides who had been taking an evening turn in the courtyard fled shrieking for the covered entrance, their skirts gathered in both fists. Lady Cerys Humphrey lost her bonnet entirely and did not stop to retrieve it. Then the bay mare went down. Not down, loose. She had torn free from a groom who was half her size and entirely unprepared, and now she screamed through the courtyard with her eyes white and her hooves sending sparks off the wet cobblestone, and every person within range made the sensible decision to get out of her way. Every person, except one. Hayden leaned forward without meaning to. She had come from somewhere near the side entrance, not running, which was the first thing he noticed. Walking. Deliberately, with her hood already fallen back and the rain hitting her full in the face, and she did not flinch at either. She moved into the mare's path at an angle, not confrontational, almost casual, and raised one open hand. She spoke. He could not hear it through the glass and the storm. But the mare heard it. The circling slowed. The screaming stopped. The great animal dropped her head toward that outstretched hand like a question finally answered. Hayden stood very still. Behind him, the fire crackled. The rain hammered the glass. He did not move from the window for a long time. He found her the following morning, which he later decided was not entirely accidental. Max Andrews had delivered the information with his usual precision. Catherine Phillips, companion to Lady Cerys Humphrey, daughter of the late Dr. Caitlin Phillips, in attendance at Vane Court in no official capacity whatsoever. Not a bride. Not a prospect. Simply a quiet presence at the edge of someone else's invitation. Hayden had nodded and said nothing further. Then he had gone to the library. She was already there. She did not hear him enter, or if she did, she gave no indication of it. She was halfway up the rolling ladder on the east wall, one hand braced against the shelf, the other tilting a book toward the grey morning light coming through the upper window as though checking whether it was the one she actually wanted. She was dressed plainly again. No attempt at the ornamentation the other women had arrived in. Just a dark dress, her hair pinned without ceremony, and an expression of complete absorption that suggested the rest of Vane Court had temporarily ceased to exist for her. He should have announced himself. He was aware of that. Instead he said, "That one's a disappointment. The first half promises more than it delivers." She turned on the ladder without startling, which itself was notable. Most people, caught unaware in a duke's private library, startled. She looked directly at him. Not at his collar, not at some careful middle distance, not with the practiced downward glance he had grown accustomed to receiving. Directly at him, with a steady, assessing quality that suggested she was deciding, in real time, whether his opinion on the book was worth considering. "I'll form my own conclusion," she said, and turned back to the shelf. He stood there for a moment, caught between surprise and something that felt uncomfortably close to amusement. They talked for 20 minutes after that, about the book, then about the library, then about nothing in particular, the way conversation sometimes moves when neither person is performing for the other. She disagreed with him twice, without apology. She laughed once, without calculation. When she finally left, he remained by the shelves a while longer. Every woman downstairs had looked at him like a door they were hoping to open. Catherine Phillips had looked at him like a person. It was, he realized, an almost entirely unfamiliar experience. Lady Emma Leonard had not survived 3 seasons in London by being careless. She had watched the library door for the better part of an hour the previous evening, and she had watched Hayden Quinn emerge from it with a particular quality of distraction that had nothing to do with books. She knew that look. She had spent considerable effort trying to produce it herself over the past 4 days, through careful conversation and precisely arranged proximity, and had achieved nothing resembling it. A companion had managed it in a morning. Emma sat with her embroidery at the drawing-room window and said nothing, which was how she did her most serious thinking. The other brides chattered around her, about the weather, about the restored East Wing, about the Duke's shoulders, which had apparently become a topic of significant interest. Emma listened without appearing to and turned the problem over quietly in her mind. Catherine Phillips. Companion. Daughter of a doctor. No title, no fortune, no legitimate reason to be standing anywhere near the center of this particular arrangement. And yet, she set down her embroidery that afternoon and found her brother in the billiards room, which was where Mason Stone went when he wanted to appear occupied without doing anything of consequence. "I need you to go to Alawick," she said, closing the door behind her. Mason looked up from the table. He was 3 years younger than Emma and had inherited their father's talent for causing damage without appearing to try. She had always found this useful. "What's in Alawick?" he said. "Catherine Phillips' history," she said. "Her father was a doctor. His name was Dr. Caitlin Phillips. I want to know why a man of his profession left a daughter with nothing and no prospects beyond carrying another woman's correspondence." Mason considered this with a slow smile of someone who enjoyed this kind of errand. "And if there's nothing to find?" "There is always something to find," Emma said evenly. "You simply have to know which questions to ask and which doors to knock on after dark." She returned to the drawing room and picked up her embroidery. Across the room, through the tall window, she could see the courtyard where Catherine Phillips had stood in the rain 2 nights ago, utterly composed, entirely unaware she had just made herself a problem worth solving. Emma pulled her thread tight and smiled at nothing in particular. Catherine had learned early that the most honest information in any great house never came from the drawing room. It came from the back passage, the scullery stairs, the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the larder where the staff moved quickly and spoke quietly and noticed everything that the guests above them chose not to see. She had grown up adjacent to houses like Vane Court, never quite inside them, never quite outside, and that particular education had served her well enough. It was Harriet who found her. Catherine was returning Lady Kerris's altered gloves to her room via the back stairs when the kitchen girl appeared at the bottom landing, slightly breathless, with the expression of someone who had been deciding for the better part of an hour whether to speak. "Miss Phillips," Harriet said, dropping her voice immediately. "I wasn't sure whether to say anything. Only I thought, if it were me, I'd want to know." Catherine stilled. "Know what?" Harriet glanced once toward the kitchen passage behind her, then back. "There was a gentleman in Alawick yesterday, asking questions at the inn, then at the records office, then at old Mrs. Pace's door, who used to keep house for Dr. Fenn." She paused. "He was asking after your father, Miss. Dr. Caitlin Phillips. What happened with the Gregory case? Whether there were papers." The gloves in Catherine's hands became very still. "Did anyone say who sent him?" she asked. Her voice came out leveler than she felt, which was its own kind of muscle memory. "No one said. But one of the stable boys recognized him coming back through the gates last evening." Harriet hesitated. "Mr. Stone, miss. The gentleman who came with Lady Leonard." Catherine said nothing for a moment. The back passage was cold and smelled of coal and damp stone and the distant warm bread of the kitchen below, and she stood in it and let the information settle into its proper shape. She had known, in the way one always quietly knows the things one hopes will not arrive, that her father's name would surface eventually. It always did. The Gregory case had a way of following the Phillips name like weather. She thanked Harriet quietly, pressed her hand once, and continued up the stairs. By the time she reached Lady Kerris's door, she had already made her decision. She did not sleep. Not from panic. Catherine had never been particularly susceptible to panic, but from the particular restlessness of a decision already made that the body has not yet caught up with. She lay in the narrow guest room that had been assigned to companions and looked at the ceiling and thought about her father, who had been a careful man brought down by a careless accusation, and about Summer Gregory, whose name had started all of it, and about the fact that Mason Stone was already one step ahead of her. She would not let him arrive at Hayden Quinn before she did. In the morning she found Max Andrews in the corridor outside the study, organizing the Duke's correspondence with the focused air of a man who considered interruption a personal affront. "I need 10 minutes, she said. Max looked up. His expression was not unkind, but it was precise. "Miss Phillips, the Duke's schedule this morning." 10 minutes, she said again, quietly. "Please." Something in the way she said it, without performance, without the breathless urgency people usually deployed when requesting impossible things, seemed to give him pause. He looked at her for a moment, then down at his correspondence, then back. "I'll see what I can do," he said. He did. She was shown into the study 20 minutes later. Hayden was standing at the window when she entered, and he turned with the slight surprise of a man who had been told only that someone required his time, not who. He gestured toward the chair across the desk. He Saturday. And Catherine, who had rehearsed nothing because she had found rehearsal made honesty harder, simply began. She told him about her father, about the case of Summer Gregory, who had died under circumstances that required explanation, and about how that explanation had settled, without sufficient evidence, upon Dr. Caitlin Phillips, whose reputation had not survived the weight of it. She told it plainly, without editorializing, the way her father had always told difficult things, as though the truth was better served by steadiness than by feeling. When she finished, the study was very quiet. Hayden had not looked away from her once. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because," Catherine said, "someone else is planning to. And I would rather you heard the true version first." The dinner was the largest since the brides had arrived. Lord Kieran had come up from the village, which meant the table was extended, the good silver produced, and Lady Arlia Quinn seated everyone with the strategic precision of a woman who understood that proximity at dinner was its own form of argument. Catherine sat near the foot of the table, beside Lady Kerris, where companions customarily sat, present enough to be useful, removed enough to be forgettable. She had dressed carefully without appearing to. She ate the first 2 courses with the calm of someone who had decided, somewhere between the study and the dining room, that whatever happened tonight would happen, and composure was the only thing she had full control over. Mason Stone was seated 4 places up on the opposite side. She had felt his eyes on her twice before the soup was cleared. It was during the 3rd course that he struck. Not loudly, that was not his style. He did it in the manner of a man making pleasant conversation, his voice carrying just far enough, his tone just curious enough to avoid the appearance of malice. "I had occasion to visit Alawick this week," he said, addressing the middle of the table generally. "Charming village. Surprisingly good memory, the people there." A brief pause. They spoke quite vividly about a Dr. Caitlin Phillips. A local physician, I understand, connected to rather an unfortunate business. Something involving a patient. A Miss Summer Gregory, I believe. The table did not go silent. It went careful, which was worse. Catherine set down her fork without sound. "The Gregory case," Mason continued, with the meditative air of a man simply thinking aloud. "Negligence, wasn't it? Or something adjacent to it? I only mention it because I understand the doctor had family in attendance this week." His gaze moved, with theatrical casualness, toward the foot of the table. "Miss Phillips, perhaps you might." "I'm familiar with the case." The voice came from the head of the table. Hayden Quinn set down his wine glass with the particular quietness of a man who has chosen his moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The table arranged itself around his stillness the way rooms always did, and he looked at Mason Stone with an expression that was not anger so much as its cooler, more permanent cousin. "In fact," Hayden said, "I have been familiar with it for some time." The table waited. Mason Stone's pleasant expression had not quite fallen, but it had developed uncertainty around the edges that he was working to conceal. Lady Emma, 3 seats down, had gone very still in the particular way of someone recalculating. Hayden reached into his interior coat pocket and produced a folded letter, which he set on the tablecloth beside his wine glass without ceremony. He did not unfold it. He did not need to. The simple fact of its existence had already changed the atmosphere in the room. "Ethan Gregory," Hayden said, addressing the table with the same measured calm he had opened with, is the brother of Summer Gregory, whose death in 1851 was attributed, incorrectly, to the negligence of Dr. Caitlin Phillips. He paused. Mr. Gregory contacted me directly, some months ago, having spent years attempting to correct. His letter contains a full account of the medical circumstances, supported by a second physician's assessment, which makes clear that his sister's death was the result of a condition that no intervention, however skilled, could have altered. He looked at Mason then, with the patience of a man who has been waiting for precisely this moment. Dr. Phillips was not negligent, Hayden said. He was convenient. The word landed quietly and did considerable damage. Lord Kieran, at the midpoint of the table, cleared his throat. One of the younger brides had developed a sudden intense interest in her plate. Lady Kerris, beside Catherine, reached beneath the tablecloth and pressed her hand once, briefly, and said nothing. Mason opened his mouth. I would think carefully, Hayden said, without looking away, about whatever comes next. Mason closed his mouth. Lady Emma set down her fork with perfect composure and dabbed her lips with her napkin and looked at no one in particular, which was the closest she would come, Catherine suspected, to an admission of anything. Hayden picked up his wine glass, turned to Lord Kieran, and asked a question about the Allowick Road repairs that had apparently been under discussion for some months. The dinner continued. Catherine looked down at her hands in her lap and found, to her mild surprise, that they were entirely steady, as though some weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it had simply, quietly, been set down. Winter released Vane Court slowly, the way it always did in the north, grudgingly, in stages, leaving frost on the stone steps well into March before finally conceding to something that resembled warmth. By the time the chapel at the edge of the grounds was dressed with early spring branches, most of the brides had long since returned to their respective counties. Lady Emma Leonard had departed the morning after the dinner with her luggage immaculately packed and her composure entirely intact, which Catherine thought was, in its own way, impressive. Mason Stone had left an hour before his sister, without saying goodbye to anyone. The house had exhaled after that. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a room after a window is opened. It was Max Andrews who told Lady Arlia, and Lady Arlia who told everyone else, though by then most of Vane Court had already worked it out through the particular alchemy of observation that runs through old houses like current through water. The way the Duke had altered his morning route to pass the East Corridor. The way a certain companion had stopped apologizing for occupying space she had every right to occupy. The way two people who had each spent considerable time being invisible to the world had, in each other's company, become entirely present. Hayden proposed in the library. Of course he did. He did it without a speech, which Catherine had appreciated, because speeches of that kind required an audience and neither of them had ever been comfortable performing for one. He simply said what was true, in the direct way she had first noticed in him and had not stopped noticing since, and she answered him the same way. They were married on a Thursday morning in the chapel that smelled of beeswax and cold stone and the particular green freshness of branches cut too early in the season. Lady Arlia wept with the controlled efficiency of a woman who had planned for this outcome and was none the less surprised to feel it arrive. Lady Kerris wept without any efficiency at all. Max Andrews stood very straight near the door and looked at the middle distance in the manner of a man experiencing an emotion he had not scheduled. Hayden and Catherine stood at the front of the chapel and said what they meant. No armor. No performance. No careful management of what showed on their faces. Just two people, finally, without anything left to hide. If this story moved you even a little, if you found yourself holding your breath at that dinner table, or standing in the rain with Catherine, or watching Hayden Quinn finally choose what was real over what was convenient, then you already know this is the kind of story worth staying for. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already coming, and you do not want to be the last one through the gates. We will see you there.